They say grief takes time, but what happens when love returns too soon, before the world says you're allowed to feel it? This is the story of how I lost the love of my life and found someone new before I thought I deserved to. His name was Harold. We met in 1975 at a library, both reaching for the same book, Wuthering Heights. He was gentle, thoughtful, always bringing me tea without asking. We raised 3 children, built a quiet life, and when he got sick, I sat beside his bed every day, until the last. Harold had a way of making the quiet moments feel like poetry. He wasn't grand or overly romantic, but he remembered the little things. How I liked my tea steeped for exactly 3 minutes, how I hated it when the mail piled up, how my fingers trembled when I was overwhelmed. He used to write me short letters and hide them in books I hadn't read yet. Even after 40 years of marriage, he'd still kiss my knuckles when I was sad. The day he passed, I felt like time split in two, the life with Harold and the life after. I wasn't ready to live the latter. Not every year with Harold was easy. There was one time, during our 3rd year of marriage, that he nearly moved out. Money was tight. I was overwhelmed with 2 toddlers and a part-time job, and he had just lost his father. We fought often, but one night I came home and found him asleep on the kitchen floor, surrounded by unpacked groceries. He'd walked miles to save on cab fare. I sat beside him and cried. We didn't say a word, but in that silence, we promised to stay. That moment taught me something lasting. Love doesn't just survive storms, it is built in them. In his final weeks, Harold became more like a memory in motion. He slept often, his body thinner than I had ever seen. But his eyes, those stayed kind. We watched old black and white movies from our youth, barely talking, just holding hands. One night he woke up and whispered, "You made this life beautiful." I held on to that like oxygen. It was the last full sentence he ever spoke. The next morning, I kissed his forehead and told him it was okay to rest. He didn't respond, but I think he heard me. The day I met Harold, I was wearing mismatched shoes. I had been rushing out of a bus in the rain and ducked into the library just to dry off. He noticed before I did, smiled, and said, "That's either brilliant fashion or a brilliant distraction." I laughed, embarrassed. He offered me a tissue. I offered him my name. That was the beginning. Our first date was in a little tea shop tucked behind a bakery. He brought a folded newspaper and asked me about poetry. I quoted Emily Dickinson, and he wrote her line in his notebook, "Hope is the thing with feathers." Years later, he quoted it again when the house was too quiet. I kept hearing his slippers down the hallway. I kept setting 2 plates at dinner. Grief didn't come all at once. It came in waves and silence. I joined a bereavement group, mostly to get out of the house. That's where I met James. Our children flew in from different cities, wrapped me in warmth, and left after 2 weeks. I stood in the doorway, waving goodbye, and the moment their cars disappeared around the bend, I crumbled onto the front steps. For days, I wore his sweater around the house. I sprayed his cologne on the pillow beside mine. I replayed old voicemails just to hear his voice say, "See you soon, sweetheart." The bereavement group was full of fragile souls. held together by coffee cups and shared grief. We didn't talk much at first, but being in that room meant I didn't feel quite so alone. I would catch myself talking aloud in empty rooms as if Harold were just out of sight. "Do you remember this song?" I'd whisper to the radio. I'd hold on to his old wool cardigan at night, even in summer, because it smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. Him. I'd open drawers just to see his handwriting again on old receipts and grocery lists. Little fragments of the man I loved were tucked everywhere in that house. And part of me feared that if I stopped looking for them, he would truly be gone. When we buried Harold, the sun was too bright. I remember thinking the weather was inappropriate, too cheerful for so much loss. I held his favorite tie in my pocket during the service, blue silk with tiny white dots. He wore it on our wedding day. I rubbed it between my fingers to keep from breaking. Afterward, I couldn't bring myself to go home. I wandered the cemetery until the shadows grew long, whispering, "What now?" The first trip to the grocery store alone felt like a betrayal. I stood in the dairy aisle, frozen, unsure whether to buy the yogurt he liked. I didn't. It felt wrong. I wept quietly in the soup aisle because his favorite tomato bisque was on sale. Coming home to a house with no sound was like stepping into a photograph of a life I no longer lived. The light still came through the windows, but it felt sharper, colder. Our children didn't say much when I started mentioning James. I could feel their caution, like they were walking through the remnants of their father's life and afraid I was sweeping it away. James had lost his wife a year before. He was kind, soft-spoken, never asked too many questions. One day after group, he asked if I wanted coffee. I said yes, not knowing why. We talked for hours. About memories, about music, about the ache that never leaves. I almost said no. I remember hesitating, thinking it was too soon, too strange. But something in James's eyes wasn't flirtation. It was familiarity. Not in a romantic sense, but in that aching understanding only two people marked by loss can share. We sat by the window of a quiet cafe. I wrapped my hands around the mug just to feel something warm. He told me how his wife used to fold towels into perfect squares. I told him Harold always made the worst coffee, but brought it to me anyway. We laughed, then paused, then laughed again, softer. Something about being understood without explanation felt like oxygen. That first coffee stretched into 2, then 3, not on purpose, but because we felt less alone when speaking in each other's company. James didn't try to entertain me or distract me. He just sat across from me and let silence exist without awkwardness. Sometimes we'd sit for 20 minutes without saying a word, and it still felt like a conversation. I learned he played guitar, that his wife used to sing. He learned I once wanted to open a bookstore, but life had other plans. We shared dreams we had long buried, and somehow, in naming them again, they stirred back to life. At our 5th coffee meeting, James brought a playlist on a USB stick. Just songs that got me through the first year, he said. We sat in his car, listening. When Bridge Over Troubled Water came on, we both cried, but neither of us turned it off. Sharing grief is like stitching two frayed edges together. There's pain, but also a quiet strength in holding the thread together. James and I started walking after our coffees, just a block, then two. Once we ended up at a tiny bookstore. He bought me a book of poems, Mary Oliver. Inside the cover, he wrote, "For the days when remembering feels heavier than breathing." I read those lines every night for a week, and each time I cried a little less. It was small, barely a chuckle, but it was the first time I laughed since Harold passed, and that laughter felt like betrayal. I cried on the drive home. How could I laugh when Harold was barely gone? I told myself it was just coffee, just companionship. We were talking about how grief makes you forget things, groceries, birthdays, even your own name some mornings. And I told him how I once poured orange juice into my tea. He laughed. I laughed. Then I covered my mouth in horror. Tears came before I could stop them. I whispered, "I'm not supposed to laugh yet." He reached across the table, not to touch, just to be there. "Maybe laughter is the breath you've been holding since he left," he said, and that stayed with me. Laughter after loss feels like disloyalty, but it's actually the softest rebellion against sorrow. That first laugh with James wasn't wild or loud. It bubbled up gently, surprising both of us. He smiled, I looked away, and my hands trembled. He didn't make a joke about it, didn't try to lighten the moment. He just sat with me as the tears came after, and that made me feel safe enough to let the joy live beside the grief, not instead of it. It started with whispers, then side eyes. A neighbor said, "Already moving on." A friend said, "Harold must be turning in his grave." I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask, what is the correct number of days before a widow is allowed to feel joy again? It wasn't just strangers, it was my own sister. She said, "Do you think Harold would be okay with this?" And I didn't know how to answer. I stopped mentioning James. I downplayed things, said we were just friends, just company, just nothing serious, all while wondering why the world expects the grieving to remain statues of sorrow. Wasn't love supposed to make us more human, not less? But the worst judgment came from inside me. I still talked to Harold at night, told him about the garden, about our daughter's promotion, about James, and sometimes I asked, "Are you angry with me?" At night, I still talked to Harold. It wasn't ritual, it was habit. I told him about the neighbors, about the bluebird that landed on the porch, about how I missed his snoring and his terrible jokes. I once whispered, "I'm sorry if this feels like forgetting you." And in the silence that followed, I imagined his voice, not scolding, but kind. "Love again, live again, I want you to." Maybe it was memory, maybe it was hope. To anyone watching this, carrying guilt for healing too fast, grief has no schedule. Love doesn't come with rules. You can miss the past and still open your heart again. You're not betraying them, You're honoring them by still knowing how to feel. Grief looks different on everyone. For some, it's years of solitude. For others, it's a second love that doesn't replace, but expands. There's no expiry date on loss, but there's no start date for healing either. If you're watching this, afraid that moving forward means moving on, let me tell you, it doesn't. You can hold on and let go at the same time. You can cry and laugh, miss and still make room. And you are worthy of joy, even now, especially now. I don't know where this road with James will lead. Maybe friendship, maybe more, maybe just a kind chapter in the middle of my story. But what I do know is this: Harold would want me to keep living. He loved me too much to want my heart buried beside him. So if you're out there, afraid to feel again, listen. You're not erasing anyone. You're becoming more of yourself. And there is no shame in healing, only courage. If I could say one thing to Harold now, it would be this: you were my great love. You still are. But I'm learning to smile again, not because I've forgotten, but because I remember. And I carry you with me in everything kind that follows. This new chapter isn't a betrayal. It's a continuation. So I wrote Harold a letter. My love, you were the beginning of me. You taught me to read poetry like prayer, to plant bulbs even when winters felt endless, to stay. But now I am walking, slowly, gently, toward the rest of my life. Not away from you, but forward with you folded inside me. Thank you for the life we built, for the soft days and hard ones, for the laughter, the garden, the quiet kind of love. I will carry you, always, yours, even now. That spring, the rose bush Harold planted years ago bloomed again. 3 perfect red roses. I clipped one and pressed it into a notebook. On the page beside it, I wrote, "You were the first chapter. You taught me to read my own heart." James and I still walk, still share coffee. We're not in a hurry. We've both learned how long it takes to become whole again. And in every quiet moment, every shared laugh, every held hand, I know Harold smiles too, because love, real love, doesn't end. It just changes shape. Sometimes I walk through the house and touch things deliberately. The banister he sanded by hand, the kitchen tile we argued over, the chair he always sat in when reading the paper. They aren't haunted, they're holy. James asked me once, "Do you think there's such a thing as a second love that doesn't compete with the first?" I told him yes, because it's not about comparison, it's about capacity. Loving him doesn't subtract from what Harold and I had. It adds a new layer to my ability to keep living. We visited the botanical gardens this month, a quiet Saturday. The air smelled like lilac and something sweet I couldn't name. James brought a blanket. We sat under a blooming dogwood tree. He leaned back and whispered, "You're different when you smile like this." I smiled harder, not because I wanted to forget Harold, but because Harold would have wanted this for me. It took me a long time to realize that grief isn't an anchor, it's an ocean, and eventually you have to swim. So if you're there, watching this, wondering whether you're allowed to feel joy again, you are. You are not disloyal for wanting to love again. You are not wrong for needing connection. You are simply human, healing in real time. I sometimes wonder if we've all been taught to mourn in straight lines. First the sadness, then the silence, then the permission to smile again. But that's not how it works. It comes in waves. It comes in flashes. It comes when I hear a song on the radio or pass by a man wearing his cologne. Grief doesn't leave. It softens, like sea glass, the edges worn by time and tears. Last Sunday, James and I sat in the backyard and watched the wind move through the trees. I told him how Harold used to rake the leaves into messy piles and jump in just to make the kids laugh. James chuckled and said, "Then we should plant a new tree this fall and name it after him." So we will. Maybe healing isn't about returning to who I was before loss. Maybe it's about honoring who I've become because of it. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest way we honor the ones we lose is by refusing to stay lost ourselves. So I'll keep loving and laughing and planting and remembering. And somewhere in the wind, I like to think Harold is smiling too.